Well, good evening, everybody, and hope you've all had a good bank holiday weekend. It's been rather warm, so hopefully it will start to cool down a little bit. Not too much, because we want the nice summer. But thank you all for coming tonight, and I know that a lot of people can't come because they've gone away for the weekend or whatever, but that's fine. So tonight's talk is entitled Feminism and the Struggle Against Gender Inequality. Now, just a few introductory remarks. First of all, there's such a vast literature on the struggles against gender inequality and also on feminist theory that I can't deal with them in as much detail as I would like. I know these are very important issues, and I'm not trying to understate their importance as social issues, but I just haven't got time. Now, as I'm clearly a man, I always feel some trepidation about talking on these issues. And yes, it would be better if it was being done by a woman. But to those who say that I can't say anything, about feminism or gender inequality, I want to say one or two things. I usually reply, well, does that mean because I'm not black, I can't say anything about racism? Or does that mean because I'm heterosexual, I can't say anything about gay rights and so on? Now, having said that, I do recognise what one female student once said to me when she said, you can't be a feminist because you can never know what it feels like to be a woman walking down a deserted, dark street at night and to hear those male footsteps behind you. I get that. I really do. I can only say that what comes in this presentation are not my views, but the theories of different feminists who are all female. So, to start with, let's just outline what the major feminist theories are. These are It includes a very wide variety of theories about the nature of society. But what I've attempted to do is to group them together into fairly identifiable similarities between different feminists. And I'm going to go through them. So let's start with liberal, or sometimes called equal rights feminism. I have to give a bit of background first of all. The roots of liberal feminism can be traced back to the Enlightenment in the 18th century. The Enlightenment was also known as the Age of Reason. It was an intellectual and cultural movement, a zeitgeist that flourished in Europe from the late 17th century to the early 19th century, probably peaking in the 18th century. It was centered on the belief that reason should be the primary source of authority and legitimacy. It challenged traditional institutions like absolute monarchy and religious orthodoxy. Enlightenment thinkers, you've probably heard of some of them: Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, David Hume. They promoted ideals such as liberty, progress, tolerance, and individual rights. And this movement laid the philosophical foundations for modern democracies, influencing the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the development of the notion of human rights. The Enlightenment eventually established, in the words of Thomas Paine, the rights of man. Now, if you don't know much about Thomas Paine was born in Thetford and he attended Thetford Grammar School. He later worked in Thetford as a supernumerary officer. He was a political philosopher and was a founding father of the US Constitution, as well as being a French revolutionary. Paine advanced Enlightenment arguments for human rights that shaped revolutionary discourses on both sides of the Atlantic. He wrote The Rights of Man in 1791 to rebut critics of the French Revolution. His authorship of this book led to a trial and conviction in absentia in England 1792 for the crime of seditious libel. His statue, as you can see here, stands in the centre of Thetford. When I was secretary of Thetford Trades Council back in the 80s, we used to organise a memorial event at the statue every year. I don't know if that still happens. But that was the rights of man. All of this prompted women to ask, but what about the rights of women? In the late 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft argued in this book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was published in 1792, a year after Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. She argued that human rights should be extended to women, rights within marriage, the right to divorce, the right to own property, for access to contraception, the right to vote, the right to equal pay for work of equal value, the right to equal access to occupations, the right to access education, and so on. All of these things were denied to women. But what she argued for was that these things should be available to women within existing social arrangements. You should read it because it's an inspiring read, and Wollstonecraft could be said to be the founding mother of liberal feminist philosophy. It was commonly thought at the time that women were intellectually inferior to men. She argued that women were not naturally intellectually inferior to men, but only appeared to be so because they lacked education. She suggested that both men and women should be treated as rational beings, and she imagined a future social order based on reason. One of Wollstonecraft's most scathing critiques in The Rights of Woman is of the false and excessive sensibility in women. She argued that women who succumb to sensibility are, in her words, blown about by every momentary gust of feeling. And because they are, in her words again, the prey of their senses, they cannot think rationally. In fact, she claims that these kind of women do harm not only to themselves, but also to the entire civilization. These are not women who can help refine a civilization, but they are women who will destroy it. Wollstonecraft didn't argue that reason and feeling should act independently of each other. Rather, she believed that they should inform each other. In many ways, though, the rights of woman, if I'm going to give any criticism of it, is inflected by a bourgeois view of the world. So, for example, Wollstonecraft is no friend of the poor. In her national plan for education, for example, she said that after the age of 9, the poor, except for those who were brilliant, should be separated from the rich and taught in another school. But then again, maybe she was just a woman of her time. Couple of other things about Mary Wollstonecraft. Her personal life probably helped shape her convictions. So, for example, her father was a very violent man who would beat Mary's mother in drunken rages. And as a teenager, Wollstonecraft used to lay outside the door of her mother's bedroom to protect her. And she played a similar maternal role for her younger sisters, Everina and Eliza, throughout her life. She was also, of course, the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. But the first wave of real feminism really came much later in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the 1860s, Millicent Garrett Fawcett, not to be confused with my name, Forbert, started campaigning for women's suffrage by legal challenge. And between 1897 and 1919, she led Britain's largest women's rights association, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. She tried to broaden women's chances of higher education, first as a governor of Bedford College, which is now the Royal Holloway, and by co-founding Newnham College, Cambridge. She argued against the tactics of the more militant Women's Social and Political Union, which is commonly known as the suffragettes, when she said this, dismissing all attempts at violence in her, this was in later on, in her book in 1924, which was called What I Remember. However, as by the late 19th and early 20th century, others in the Women's Social and Political Union, frustrated by a lack of progress, argued that the only way to improve women's position was by civil disobedience and breaking the law. So the Women's Social and Political Union, led by the Pankhursts, Emmeline Pankhurst, Emily Pankhurst, Christabel Pankhurst, and Sylvia Pankhurst, campaigned for the right for women to vote and to be able to stand for elected positions, female suffrage, in other words. They had no qualms about breaking the law. They smashed shop windows, they set fire to buildings, and they chained themselves to railings. Emily Davison, one of the suffragettes, threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Derby, killing herself in the process. They were regarded as terrorists by the state. And I think it's worth noting the sheer hypocrisy of Yvette Cooper, who, when she was Home Secretary, proscribed Palestine action under the Terrorism Act, when she came to the Commons to vote for the legislation, she came straight from a meeting celebrating the suffragettes, who were far more violent than Palestine Action have ever been. But anyway, that's another story. Many suffragettes were imprisoned and force-fed when they went on hunger strike. Nevertheless, they first achieved the vote for women over 30, then parity with men, which at the time was 21, by the 1930s. If we move on to the Second World War, in the Second World War, large numbers of women were drafted into the workforce in both the States and in Britain to do jobs that men had traditionally done. So, for example, construction and shipbuilding, that previously men had told women that they were incapable of doing. This encouraged women to demand equality in the workplace with men. This poster from 1942 depicts a 17-year-old woman who worked in the shipyards and was used in making the film Rosie the Riveter. If you've never seen the film Rosie the Riveter, you can now get the full film plus interviews with the women who were there, including one with Rosie herself. You can get all of that on YouTube, and they're well worth a watch. So when I say that women did the jobs that men usually did, for example, whenever you walk across Westminster Bridge in London or drive across it, one of the things that you have to bear in mind is that Westminster Bridge was rebuilt during the war almost entirely with female labour. In fact, Thames dockers and lightermen used to call it the Ladies' Bridge. So why do so few people know about this? Well, it's because after the war, when men were returning home from the front, governments in the States and in Britain launched propaganda campaigns to force women back into the home to rebuild the family. Post-war propaganda in Britain actively worked to reintegrate women into domestic roles after the Second World War, despite their significant contributions during the war. Government and media messaging consistently portrayed women's wartime work as temporary and patriotic, emphasizing that their role was to support men at war and return to the home afterwards. Propaganda reiterated that women's proper place was in the home, reinforcing traditional gender roles. The image of the war worker, like Rosie the Riveter, was deliberately phased out by 1946, replaced by idealized depictions of the homemaker, the wife, and mother. This shift was evident in advertising, which promoted consumer goods and domestic life as central to women's identity. And cultural and economic pressures reinforce this narrative. So things like the closure of state-funded nurseries, which had blossomed during the Second World War, the continuation of the so-called family wage model that treated women's income as secondary, and the persistence of marriage bars in certain professions, all these things discouraged women from remaining in the workforce. Also, I mean, things that you wouldn't think of, like the launch of the new look fashion in 1947 by Christian Dior. That kind of symbolized a return to traditional femininity with tight corseted silhouettes and the emphasis on domesticity, seen by some as a deliberate attempt to reverse wartime gains in women's independence. And also, historical accounts confirm that while women had gained new confidence and economic independence during the war, post war propaganda and policy sought to return them to the kitchen, framing domesticity as both natural and essential to national recovery. Even though most women were forced out of employment in traditional male occupations, either back into the home or into low paid menial work, the seeds had been sown, and women's discontent soon began to spill over again in the 1960s. But before we go on to the 1960s, here's an example from that propaganda campaign that I've taken from a home economics book in 1950. Tips to look after your husband, have his dinner ready, prepare yourself, clear away the clutter, prepare the children, minimize all noise. And some don'ts, make him comfortable, listen to him, make the evening his. And the goal is to make your home a place of peace and order where your husband can renew himself in body and spirit. That was from a home economics book in 1950. So, after World War II, the most famous feminist was probably Simone de Beauvoir. Her book, The Second Sex, is a seminal work in feminist literature. Writing in the 40s and 50s, she was a liberal feminist who argued that it wasn't any particular social or economic system that caused gender difference and gender inequality. The family, education, and the media, in other words, the agencies of socialization, were her main targets. Inequality and difference are caused by gender socialization. Gender roles have simply been built up over time and become embedded in our culture. So, what she argued for was a re socialisation campaign. First, to change the law that was needed to redistribute existing social and economic rewards along more egalitarian lines, and then a re socialisation programme. Now, you might wonder why I've put that speech bubble from her. She was married to the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. And when I was researching her life, I discovered that she had told friends privately that she actually loved doing housework. Um, Even though most women were forced out of employment in traditional male occupations after the war, either back into the home or into low paid menial work, as I said just now, the seeds were sown by their wartime experience, and women's discontent soon began to spill over again in the 1960s. So that's liberal feminism. So, what are the criticisms of liberal feminism? The main criticism of liberal feminism is that there is no real theory about why women's subordination came about in the first place. Also, it just seeks to bring women in without explaining what it is about social structures that cause their disadvantage. So that's why it's sometimes called equal rights feminism. It doesn't seek to change society fundamentally. It just seeks to give women equality within the existing structures of society. And I thought this cartoon expresses that sentiment quite neatly. Now, one thing to say is that all um, feminists are liberal feminists in that they fight for greater equality within existing structures of society. However, some go much further and argue that without fundamental change to the structures of society, women will always be disadvantaged. And this is where Marxist feminism comes in. Marxist feminists argue that liberal feminism doesn't challenge the real cause of women's subordination, and that is the economic system. In modern societies, of course, this is capitalism. The interests of capitalism, argue Marxist feminists in general, and of individual capitalists specifically, um, and not the interests of society as a whole, are best served by the current arrangements, or as they were in the 1960s. Um, so, firstly, Marxist feminists argue that housework, or domestic labour, as they pointedly call it, like cooking, cleaning, shopping, and so on, are not recognised by capitalism as commodities, despite the fact that women's housework contributes massively to the economy. It is free labour. Unpaid domestic labour benefits capitalism and capitalists massively. And if you say, oh, yeah, but men do a lot of housework now, well, all surveys show that women still take most of the responsibility for domestic labour. Secondly, Marxists argue that by socialising children in the home, women are providing the next generation of labour power for capitalism for free. Now, young women that I've taught sociology to over many, many years have been saying to me for many, many years, oh, but our generation's going to be different. And I've been hearing that from young women for as long as I've been teaching, which is a very long time. Yet, when I go past the junior school, which is just round the corner to me at the end of the school day, who is it that's picking the kids up from school? The vast majority are women, who I suspect are young mums. And most of those who aren't have grey hair, probably grandparents. So, in many ways, things haven't changed. Thirdly, Marxist feminists argue that women in the home provide a cell where male breadwinners can recuperate and recharge their batteries to provide capitalism with the next day's labour power. Housewives provide this service for free to capitalism. Now, if that's not true, then why has the capitalist class, in other words, big business, always opposed the public provision of nurseries, wages for housework, and so on, always saying that the country can't afford it? Marxist feminists also point to women's roles as a convenient reserve army of labour. The nature of capitalist economies is such that they periodically have a tendency to overproduce. This means that there's an increasing need over time for a group that can be brought into the workforce in the good times and be dispensed with in the bad. And women are particularly suited to this role in secondary labour markets where women predominate. In other words, low paid, more casual work with poor conditions and poor pension entitlements, such as cleaners. In bad times, they can be said to be returning to their natural roles as homemakers. The contemporary gig economy, where there are no fixed hours, is probably the epitome of this reserve army of labour. In addition, Marxist feminists argue that capitalism gains from regarding women as secondary workers as they can be paid much less. In 1968, however, 187 female upholstery workers at the Ford Motor Company's Dagenham plant in Essex voted to go on strike to protest about unequal pay and job classification. The women who sewed car seat covers had been reclassified from skilled to unskilled, resulting in a 15% pay cut compared to male workers doing similar work. Although they initially sought recognition of their skilled labour, the strike evolved into a broader fight for equal pay for equal work. Their action halted the whole of Ford's production worldwide because no one else could replicate their specialised sewing skills. After 4 weeks, they returned to work following an offer of 92% of the male B grade pay. The story of this small band of very brave women was made into a film called Made in Dagenham. And you should see the film if you haven't seen it already. It's really inspiring. Now, I was brought up and was still living in Dagenham at the time this all happened. And I can vividly remember the vile abuse, the vile level of abuse that these women got on their picket lines. The government got involved, and the Labour minister, Barbara Castle, promised legislation. It ultimately ushered in the 1970 Equal Pay Act and the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act. Yet, because it's not in the interest of capital to do so, employers have consistently opposed equal pay for women. So not much has changed. It's still nowhere, after all these years, nowhere near equal, despite women struggling for equal pay with men. So, to give you an idea of the situation today, the Office for National Statistics 2025 survey showed that women earn 12.8% less than men on average. And this means that women earn 87 pence for every pound that's earned by men. There are significant differences between different sectors of the economy. In finance and insurance, for example, the gap is 27.2%. Women are also 50% more likely than men to be in low paid work. 16.8% of female jobs are paid below the real living wage, which is £12.60 an hour. I think it's more in London. Can't remember what it is. 4 out of 5 employers still pay men more than women. Um, so women effectively work 47 days a year for free compared to men. And even when comparing middle earners, men still earn more. And structural factors continue to drive the gap. I mean, structural factors include things like part-time work that women are forced to do because of childcare responsibilities or caring for an elderly relative or whatever, childcare responsibilities, their underrepresentation in senior roles, all these things continue to drive the gap, especially amongst older workers. However, successes more recent, there have been successes more recently, but the road to equality has been long and hard. So, for example, in December 2024, after years of struggle, Birmingham City Council finally agreed to a £760 million framework to settle an equal pay dispute with 6,000 women who were historically underpaid compared to those in male dominated positions. The agreement was finally negotiated between the council and Unison and the GMB. The law concerning equal pay has since the Equal Pay Act has been subsumed into the Equality Act 2010, which requires that men and women are paid the same when doing the same or almost the same job, and when doing work of equal value or work rated as equivalent. Yet it has taken all these years since 1970 to get for these women to get equal pay. Marxist feminists also argue that women are exploited as consumers because capitalism encourages the cult of femininity to create markets for slimming products, for clothes, for makeup, cosmetic surgery, and so on. Marxist feminists also argue that capitalism exploits women as sex objects. Women's sexuality is sold as commodities. Miss World contests, page three girls, men's magazines, pornography, sex work, massage parlours, and so on. Total liberation for women is therefore, argue Marxist feminists, only possible with the overthrow of capitalism. However, Marxist feminism has been criticised quite extensively. First of all, it doesn't adequately explain women's subordination in all societies. Radical feminists, who we're going to look at in a moment, argue that women's subordination is ubiquitous. It isn't just under capitalism. Although gender inequality was never as great in the old state socialist Soviet Union as it is in Western societies, it was still present. Communists argue, oh, well, that was because it would take many generations to eliminate thousands of years of inequality. And also, they would say there are examples of where there is much greater equality in socialist societies. If you take Cuba, for example. Nevertheless, other feminists argued that it was evident in pre-capitalist societies. In fact, even more so in pre-capitalist societies. In ancient slave societies such as Greece, for example, women were considered to be an inferior species and were treated as such. So feminists in the 1970s argued that a new concept, not capitalism, was needed to explain female subordination to men in all societies. That concept is patriarchy, and this is where radical feminism came in the 1970s. For radical feminists, it is patriarchy, not capitalism, that is the main structure of the oppression of women. Patriarchy, they argue, is a universal system of power where men and women constitute different classes and where all men benefit from oppressing women. It is violence, they argue, that maintains the patriarchy, in particular through rape. And what radical feminists argue is that all women have either experienced rape or experienced the fear of it. Therefore, all women are victims, even if most men don't rape women. The point is that they have the power to do so. Therefore, all men are potential oppressors. Now, remember this French woman, Giselle Pellicot, who was drugged by her husband over many years to allow at least 50 men to rape her? She took the unusual and very brave step of waiving anonymity in their prosecution, insisting that all evidence be shown in public. The offenders got between 3 and 15 years in jail, and her husband got 20 years. But the point I want to make about using this case is it's indicative of a patriarchal society that the defense of many of the perpetrators was the misogynistic argument that Giselle's husband had given could consent to sex on his wife's behalf. And this isn't just an isolated case, because according to the Office for National Statistics, in the year ending March 2025, there were 71,227 recorded rape offences in the UK, and only 2.1% of them ended in a conviction. Then, of course, there are the Epstein files that refer to a huge collection of documents, emails, images, and videos released by the US Department of Justice under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, signed into law in November 2025. These files total over 6 million pages across multiple releases. They include FBI investigation reports, flight logs, contact lists, and court documents related to the financier Jeffrey Epstein, and convicted sex trafficking offender and his associates. A major release in January of this year included 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. In March 2026, the Department of Justice released previously withheld FBI interview summaries detailing allegations from a woman who claimed she was sexually assaulted by President Donald Trump as a minor in the 1980s, with Epstein allegedly introducing her. The Department of Justice stated these were mistakenly withheld due to being coded as duplicative, though the woman's credibility was reportedly assessed positively by FBI agents. The White House dismissed the allegations as baseless and linked to a woman with a criminal history. The files triggered investigations in Europe, including charges against the former Norwegian Prime Minister and arrests of British figures Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Peter Mandelson. It is abundantly clear that the huge scale of the sexual abuse of young women and girls by the powerful is so widespread as to validate the claims of radical feminists beyond any doubt. And then, of course, there are online influencers like Andrew Tate. Now, I'm not saying that these young men accessed stuff by Andrew Tate, but the influence of men like him have on young men in particular was shown this week with the case of three boys being convicted of rape and actually filming the abuse and putting it on social media. The male judge disgracefully never gave them custodial sentences. But it's not just sexual abuse if that's not bad enough. Um, Over 1 million violence against women and girls related crimes were recorded in England and Wales, are recorded in England and Wales each year, making up about 20% of all recorded crime. But the estimate of the numbers affected by violence against women and girls is probably double that. Um, At least 1 in 12 women in England and Wales is a victim of violence against women and girls annually. That equates to around 2 million women. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime, and a woman is killed every 3 days in Britain. 88% are murdered by men, and 78% of these are murdered by a partner or an ex-partner. In other words, it's not so-called strangers who are mainly responsible for the high levels of rape and violence against women. 72.5% of domestic abuse victims are female, and 72% of women in Britain have experienced some form of sexual harassment in their lifetimes. Now, back in the 70s, what were radical feminists arguing were the causes of all this? They argued that marriage was the institutional source of exploitation and patriarchal power. The enemy, they argued, was not some distant capitalist, it is an intimate enemy. The source of all institutional power is in personal and intimate relations. Hence the 1970s slogan of radical feminists that the personal is political. Power is exercised not at some distant institutional level, but in very personal, intimate relations. The enemy, argued many radical feminists, is, in the words of one feminist I spoke to, the enemy is the body in the bed next to you. Also, radical feminists argue that men have created myths about sex and sexuality to ensure their domination over women. These myths about the vaginal orgasm, for example, has helped to sustain the definition of women as passive receivers of sexual pleasure from men. Liberation, radical feminists argue, will come with the abolition of heterosexual marriage and the current norms of sexuality. Women should have control over their own bodies. So, not just about having sex, but for example, abortion on demand, and also have power over their own sexuality. And one of the things they pointed to in the 60s was look at how much the pill liberated women in the 60s. What radical feminists argue is that if women didn't need men and could make an unrestricted choice of heterosexual, bisexual, lesbian, or celibate lifestyles, it would break the hold of the monogamous family. So, the solution to women's oppression is not to smash capitalism, as Marxist feminists argued, but to smash the patriarchy. Well, in terms of a critique of radical feminism, Marxist feminists or Marxist feminism is more sensitive to the differences, the different forms that patriarchy has taken over time in different social systems and in different places. Also, radical feminists also fail to recognize differences between women, differences of class, of race, and ethnicity. Radical feminists are criticized because they talk about sisterhood in a common struggle against men. But how is sisterhood possible across social classes, for example? So, going back to those women trade unionists at Ford's in 1968, they have so little in common with, for example, Margaret Thatcher, the most vicious anti trade union prime minister we've ever had. So, some theorists have suggested that both capitalism and patriarchy are responsible for women's oppression in contemporary society. This is where socialist or dual systems theory comes to the fore. One of my all-time heroes, Sylvia Pankhurst, could be said to have been a socialist feminist whose politics combined feminism with revolutionary socialism. But she was not a traditional Marxist in the Leninist sense. She sought to link the struggle for women's emancipation with the broader working class movement, emphasizing the needs of working class women who are often excluded from mainstream socialist and feminist discourses. She actually went to live and work in the East End of London, where she supported the struggles of working class women. She actually fell out with her mother and her sisters, who she regarded as middle class reactionaries. While she was initially involved with the WSPU, she broke from her mother and sisters in 1914 over their support for the wartime political truce, leading her to found the East London Federation of Suffragettes in 1912. The group focused on organising working class women and promoting socialist principles. She was actually a founder member of the British Communist Party in 1920. She also founded and edited the radical newspaper, The Workers' Dreadnought, which championed anti war, anti colonial, and pan Africanist causes. A more contemporary socialist feminist is Sylvia Walby. Sylvia Walby is Professor of Sociology at London University. She combines some arguments of Marxist feminism and some arguments of radical feminism. She argues that patriarchy and capitalism are two separate but mutually accompanying systems of oppression, whereby both systems structure and benefit from women's subordination and exploitation. In other words, she argues that they articulate each other. Socialist feminists like Walby are committed to the abolition of capitalism and the abolition of patriarchy. But what about ethnicity? Some feminists, particularly in the United States, have put a greater emphasis on ethnicity. Bell Hooks, for example, was professor of ethnic studies at a number of prestigious American universities. Note, it's not my spelling. Note that she used lowercase spelling for her name in order to decenter herself and draw attention to her work instead. In an approach known as black feminism, she is critical of the ethnocentricity of conventional feminism. The focus of Hook's writing was to explore the intersectionality of race, capitalism, and gender, and their ability to produce and perpetuate systems of oppression and class domination. She argued that racism and structures of institutional racism in particular need to be examined and theorized within feminism. To eliminate women's subordination, the system of racism must be tackled as well as patriarchy and capitalism. She was concerned with examining the specific experiences of black working class women within society. So, for example, one of the things she argued is where the family may be an instrument of subordination for white middle class women, it can be a haven from the racist outside world for many black women. Also, she argued that white middle class women were often the racist oppressors, which hardly equates with the concept of sisterhood, which I said earlier. Women's solidarity, she argued, may be an illusion. And this really leads me on to suggest, or leads feminists on to suggest, that the category woman is perhaps too all embracing. And this is where postmodern feminism comes in. Postmodern feminism is anti essentialist in that it suggests that there is no essential identity and social position of all women. It's sometimes called post structuralist feminism because postmodernist feminists argue that the gender hierarchy is much more fragmented than is suggested by the notion of a gender structure. The meaning of the word woman is differently constructed in different discourses. All women do not experience the social world in the same way. Postmodern feminists are opposed to the idea that women can be classed together and theorized about en masse as if there is a single essence to all women's lives. Traditionally, feminists tended to concentrate on white middle class women in Western societies and make unwarranted assumptions that they're talking about all women. Race, class, ethnicity, geography, etc., all need to be taken into account. So when white middle class women talk about the need to expand opportunities for women to work in the labour force in order to liberate themselves from domesticity, they don't usually mean the kind of work that working class and especially black working class women are forced to do. So, for example, Bangladeshi women working in the sweatshops in the East End of London, they're not usually talking about those kind of women. So, also, when white middle class feminists clamour for the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion, that hardly makes sense for some women who live in less developed countries where forced terminations, especially if they're expecting a girl, and forced sterilizations are the norm. For these women, it's the right to keep their fertility that's at stake. Also, with conventional feminism, especially radical feminism, seems to be a preoccupation with sex and sexuality. Now, this is irrelevant for many women in less developed countries where poverty, starvation, and a lack of basic education are everywhere, especially for women. So, for a lot of women in the what used to be called the third world, there's not much point concentrating your energies on having a good orgasm if you have no food, no shelter, no medicine, and no education. And education in particular is something that is denied to many women in some of the least developed countries. So, for example, you may remember Malala Yousafzai, who was a 14-year-old girl who was shot in the head by the Pakistan Taliban for defying their decree that girls should not be educated. She defied them by continuing to go to school. She was, you may remember, flown to Britain, where she had life-saving brain surgery and skull reconstruction at Birmingham Hospital. She vowed to return to Pakistan to continue with her education after her convalescence. But the Pakistan Taliban vowed to finish her off if she ever did. So she stayed in Britain, completing her education and going to university. And she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But she's far from alone in the world where women are denied education in many countries. 3 years ago, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan banned girls from attending secondary school and higher education institutions, including universities. The ban has already led to a shortage of skilled professionals, including doctors, nurses, teachers, and engineers, essential for Afghanistan's development. It's the only country in the world to ban women completely from higher education. But many countries still put restrictions on women's education or put obstacles in their way throughout the world. So, as Sylvia Walby says, the project for many feminist post-structuralists is to explore the variety of forms of femininity and masculinity. Such writers try to catch the nuances of different forms of femininity. So postmodernists ask, who benefits from this particular form of patriarchy? Post-structuralist feminists are therefore interested in the different narratives or stories that different women in different social circumstances have to tell, rather than lecturing them all on the cause of their oppression. And this brings us to the different standpoints of women. They need to tell their stories and the power structures that subordinate them. As Walby says here, they also need to explore the different forms of masculinity if they are to fully appreciate the power structures of society. And this is linked to different forms of sexuality. Since feminism's emphasis on the personal is political, sociologists have begun to take greater interest in studying sexualities because there is a hierarchy of sexualities, from those sexualities that are valued to those that are frowned upon. Therefore, sexuality is linked to structures of power because some sexualities are more hegemonic than others. And this is the point that's taken up by Dorothy E. Smith. Smith was a British-born Canadian ethnographer, a feminist studies scholar, a sociologist, and writer with research interests in a variety of different disciplines. She founded the sociological subdiscipline of feminist standpoint theory. In this book, she argued that feminists need to see femininity as a matrix of different accounts and perceptions defined by subjects themselves rather than as some kind of objectively defined category which is reproduced through socialization. And um, this actually led to, I was at Essex University doing my master's degree when um, the um, the uh, Sociological Society's journal gave a whole issue over to women to tell their own stories. And this kind of approach is echoed very much in the works of subsequent feminists like Judith Butler. Judith Butler argues that the task of postmodern feminist theory is not to deal with the universal, but to deal with diversity. And this means abandoning grand narratives or big stories of gender and sexuality. In Gender Trouble, Butler argues feminism has tended to reinforce the binary gender order, the very thing that it criticizes, by accepting the concept of a coherent gender identity. She argues that this dualism between men and women results from uncritically adopting the norms of heterosexuality on which the binary order depends. Now, whilst all feminists accept that gender is social, not natural, many have wrongly, in Butler's view, embraced the idea of a core identity of woman. The insistence on a coherent and unified category of woman effectively ignores, in Butler's words, the multiplicity of cultural, social, and political intersections in which the concrete array of women are constructed. In subsequent books, Butler treats gender as a performance which we are engaged in. Performativity, as she calls it, is what defines gender, and gender identity arises out of performance. It is a negotiated social construct. The body itself is not as fixed and rigid as some previous theorists may have presumed. Rather, it is much more a contested thing, as fluid as identity is, and to denaturalize the task for feminists, it's subject to change. So the task for feminists is to subvert constructions of gender identity and to denaturalize the body and sex. Traditionally, feminists have adopted an essentialist standpoint with regard to women. In other words, there's something essentially different between men and women. But concepts such as sexuality, mothering, and reproduction vary widely across and within societies and cultures. So the task for postmodern feminist theory is not to deal with the universal, but to deal with diversity, abandoning grand narratives of gender and sexuality. And my final slide that I want to look at is coming back to Sylvia Walby again, because Sylvia Walby, although she outlines what post-feminists or postmodernists are saying, Sylvia Walby in particular is concerned that this kind of postmodernist thinking has fragmented the concepts of sex, race, and class, denying the pertinence of overarching theories of patriarchy, racism, and capitalism. In other words, Warby argues that this kind of fragmentation into local narratives, each woman has her own story to tell, threatens to destroy the capacity of social theory to analyze the larger structures of society that successfully concentrate power into male hands, and it also undermines the possibility of any collective feminist politics of resistance. In other words, that all these kind of semantic discourses of postmodernism, like Butler's, become more important than political struggles over material resources, which is what Sylvia Warby concentrates on. So I hope you got something out of all that, and I've left about 15 minutes for any discussion or questions that you want to put. So can I hand back to you, please, Claire?
Hi, Jack. Well done. That was really informative. I really enjoyed that discussion tonight. It's very good. Let me have a look at opening up. Um, Hold on. Sorry, I wasn't ready. Not good, is it? Okay, so people should be able to speak in the chat now. I'm just gonna um sort out being able to talk. Sorry, guys, give me a moment. All right. To unmute themselves and raise hands and so forth if you have a question.
Have to tell me if somebody's waiting to come in, Claire.
Yeah. Does anyone have a question or comment for Jack tonight? Or are you all just taking it in? And I guess a lot of you know a lot of the issues he's raised. I remember Jack, in the 70s as well, there was the movement in America, wasn't there?
Yeah,
What they'd call, was it the second wave of feminism?
second wave. Yeah, yeah,
It was and then they were doing really well with it, weren't they? And then they brought in the ultra Christian
yeah, yeah,
American women to it was all apple pie and this and that, wasn't it, I think?
yeah. Thankfully, we had a similar thing here, but the Mary Whitehouse kind of phenomenon. But thankfully, it wasn't uh, as as forceful as it was in America.
Didn't they get those women in as well to vote for a certain president? So people would vote for a certain president.
Oh yeah, Reagan. Yeah, Reagan used those women in particular. It's usually Republicans in America. Um,
I was reading, sorry, I was reading, was it the first wave was that the Betty Friedan era?
well, it depends who you read because, there are some that argue that the first wave was Fawcett in the 19th century, and that the suffragettes in the early 20th century was the second wave. Um, and that maybe what happened during the Second World War was the third wave. And so what happened in the 60s was actually the fourth wave, but some people regard it
Mm.
as the second wave or even the first wave of feminism because, of course, prior to the 60s, it wasn't called feminism by and large. Most people referred to it as women's liberation. So it depends, on what your point of view is. Um, does somebody else want to come in?
Jack Keeker's got a hand up.
Kika. Thank you, Kika. Yeah, please come in.
Thanks again, Jack, for a really informative session and some new information that I didn't know and some really good reminders. For me, there's sort of 3 points really just to add in, just to build on what you said. The first point is the international element is was slightly missing for me, but that's just because I see myself as an international feminist, and I suppose just like the working class struggles are global. I mean, obviously, feminism is. You did mention um, a professor in the US and some of the movement in the US, but let's not forget, especially because I named my daughter after her, Clara Zetkin, and of course Rosa Luxemburg.
Yeah,
So my daughter's name is Clara, but Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin were German, well, Polish German um, revolutionary feminists. Although some would argue they're social democrats, but they're Marxists. They're sort of Marxist social democrats, but they had some critiques of Lenin and the Bolshevism.
yeah,
Um, and I think they're very much so. They were very much seen as the sort of pioneers by some more, let's say, European minded people. So I think let's definitely give them credit. Um, Another point I wanted to say is that just that term radical feminism slightly irks me because it's not really radical to just say that we want equality, even though I know that that's just the name that was given and they probably use it themselves. But just using radical feminism, uh, when actually they just want equality. Um, Another point is a lot of people say, "Oh, you're a feminist," or "Oh, I'm not a feminist." But I always try to point out, and let's all remind people that the definition of feminism is actually just equality between um, genders. And so it's not radical to be a feminist. In fact, it's a problem if you're not one. Um,
yeah.
so that's just another thought, and you can comment on any of these things. Then one other thought that came in my head, but I don't want to ramble on, right? But I can't see a lot of hands up, so I'll ramble on 2 more points. Um, One is, when we talk about um, sexism and the discrimination against women, there are so many aspects. I mean, I've had a career, I was on the board of lots of corporations, and it was very much a sort of a male-dominated industries as well. Um, and you really did have to work sort of 3 times as hard and sort of be 5 times better to get the same pay and the same promotions. But it's not just that, it's the daily so it's just all those added pressures we have, and as you said about still having to take the majority of the child rearing and home home related works, but we also have a sort of a psychological um, pressure, don't we? Because dealing with sexism on a daily basis, seeing it every day, little comments, and you get it also on the hard left. That's another topic I think we should maybe at some point discuss. There's rampant sexism on the hard left. There's a lot of chauvinist sort of mentalities, or we have meetings where it's 95% of people talking are men, sort of on a continuous basis, and then when you call it out you get completely bullied by all the men who had just, you know, done that and told that's a load of rubbish. So the psychological impact of there's been studies shown, that the because of the discrimination, so many women often don't do as well because of this perception that they're not going to do as well. It's so ingrained. So it holds people back psychologically, but also, lots of mental traumas and diseases comes from rampant exposure to sexism on a daily basis. So that I think I've said enough now. There were a few thoughts that came into my mind during your excellent talk.
Well, thank you, Keika. Yeah, can I respond to
Please.
some of the things you said? Um, I did say at the beginning that it's such a vast subject that I can't cover everything. Um, but yeah, I do take the point about not including people like Rosa Luxemburg, um, and the international dimension being rather missing from it. But I only had really an hour. Well, I spent an hour and a quarter um, talking, and I've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, it's,
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, when I was at university as a uh, during my when I did my master's degree in particular, I had a whole course on gender and feminism. So I know I'm only just scratching the surface. So there were things I left out, and I apologize if you would have preferred that I'd included those things, but I had to make some choices about what I included and what I didn't include. The thing about radical feminism is that that was a name that was adopted really as an alternative to Marxist feminism. And yeah, I mean, in many ways, you're quite right that there isn't very much radical about some of it. I'm not saying all of it, but also, I mean, you mentioned about sexism on the hard left. I don't know in particular what you had in mind, but I mean, we did see in the SWP, for example, what happened there a few years ago, which you'll probably remember, with the rape of a younger comrade, and this was covered up by the men at the top of the SWP for many years. But generally, with regard to meetings, a lot of organisations are male dominated. And I mean, one of the things that on just talking about a local thing, West Suffolk Trades Council, we have tried everything that we could possibly do to get more women to come to the Trades Council. But we do understand that there are barriers. I mean, some have told us, well, I don't like to be out at night on my own. So we said, well, can we have it a bit earlier in the day or can we have it via Zoom then? And we've experimented with that. We also know that women tend to have more childcare responsibilities. But, we're not in a position as a trades council to pay for a creche, for example. Wish we could, but we just don't have the money. So there are all sorts of institutional barriers to, when there are all male gatherings, there are all kinds of institutional barriers to making it any different. We desperately want more women on the Trades Council. Um, on what you were saying about women's perception and the psychology, I think is quite interesting because I can give one example of a number of years ago. A company wanted advertised for a particular role in the company that they were keen for women to apply. It was a big salary they were offering. No women applied. So what they decided to do was re-advertise it, but with a lower salary, and lots of women applied for it. And I think that tells you something about the way that that kind of psychology about higher paying jobs are not the kind of thing that they would give to a woman. It's kind of got embedded, unfortunately, into many women's psychology. Um, I wish it wasn't so, but they said when they kind of offered a 50% lower salary, they got loads and loads of women apply for the job. So yeah,
Great example. Thank you.
yeah.
You literally picked up on all of my points. Thank you so much.
Okay, I was scribbling them down as you were talking. Yeah.
You happy now, Kika? You got some good answers
We're
there.
happy when we have equality.
Oh well.
Yeah,
I've
no,
got a
thanks.
really cool book here on Rosa. Have you read this one? It's a graphic novel, and it's fabulous. It's
Oh,
just
I
so
haven't seen that.
oh, it's so good. It's by Kate Evans.
Hey,
Um,
Evans.
yeah, and yeah, it's a graphic biography of Rosa Luxemburg, and someone recommended it, and I love it.
Oh,
But
fantastic.
yeah, it's really good. Maybe we should do some kind of women's event.
Well, we've got the Your Party women's group. We had the kickoff event, and we've got our sponsor on the CEC, Joe Rust, and also Laura Alvarez is on there. So but we were obviously having the CEC elections, but at some point we want to kick that off, and we want to prioritize what the key areas are that we need to develop policies for, so that your party is a sort of has the best policies when it comes, so that women would who care about equality would choose your party, because we've got the most well thought through, detailed policies.
Oh, sounds very promising.
Yeah.
By the way, just uh, something you mentioned, you know, the SWP obviously have got the image problem, because they have sort of, it wasn't just the rape and the cover up of two women, but sort of a lot of sexual assaults and rampant sexism, and also kind of grooming young women as their assistants, and so and we know that the RS21 group was formed out of people who protested about it, and that's why they're sort of usually less sexist people. But what's interesting is that how the SWP is trying to sort of improve its image. So it's really quite sickening to me, but they actually did a whole series of events nationally last year, which was Rosa Luxemburg events, and they targeted young people, women, who were new to politics, and brought to try to bring them in through showing how they promote feminism. So they actually had it's part of their national strategy to sort of almost improve their image when it comes to sexism.
Right. I mean, I don't know whether it's the case now, Kika, but it was a couple of years ago that those that were responsible for the cover up are still in charge at the SWP. Is that right?
So they stayed on for an incredibly long time, and then four of them were still there last year, and I think the last person who was on that board. But I mean, this is years and years that they stayed in control, and
Yeah.
there was, of course, also women. Women were also involved, so we mustn't underestimate the power of women who sort of go along with chauvinism and sexism, and sort of bully other women who call it out, because that can very much help, endorse it, so it looks like it's not just, you know, uh, it's
Yeah.
not actually men bullying women. But yes, it's very. Let's look to see if there's anyone still left on the board. But what we do know is that the current board of the SDWP are all people who were extremely loyal to the previous, um, you know,
Yeah,
um, central committee.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I just think it was absolutely appalling the way, not just the behaviour, but the way that the behaviour was covered up. Absolutely appalling. But there you are.
It reminds me of you know, women being exploited, um, by those in power, trusting people when you had the blacklisted stuff going on. And what was it that was happening with the police as well?
Yeah.
That
Yeah. Well, what happened? I don't want to go into it in too much detail because it's a very long story. But
mm,
I was, as you know, I was a blacklisted building worker, and that's why I first went to university in the 80s, and now a member of the blacklist support group that supports those who were blacklisted. We took the employers to court um, and sued them and won our case in court for illegally blacklisting us. But what was uncovered during that was that the police had infiltrated trade unions and were also passing information about individuals and their trade union and political activities the to the employers. So what it has resulted in um, after all of this is a the Pitford inquiry, which is looking into police undercover or undercover activities by the police. And there are a number of core participants. There are the blacklisted workers like us. There's also the Lawrence family who was spied on by police after their son was killed by racists. But the third major group where undercover police were involved was environmental activists who were all women who male undercover police officers deliberately formed relationships with many of those women and in one case actually fathered children with one of those women and they are being exposed by the Pitchford inquiry as well. And they've got core participant status as well. One of them is, a friend of mine who I won't name, but she had a long relationship with a guy who she didn't know was a police officer, but he just suddenly disappeared one day, and after a couple of years, and she tried to track him down and found that he was working for the Australian police. So we all clubbed together and got her the fare to go out to Australia to confront him. But that inquiry is still going on. I mean, the Metropolitan Police in particular, have done some disgusting things in abusing those women. And but the inquiry has now gone on for more than 10 years, and it's turning into a giant establishment cover-up. But we've managed to get some things out of it already. We already know some of the names of the police officers involved who were acting under pseudonyms, which I won't go into because there's too many of them. But I think that's what you're referring to, is it?
yeah, yeah. I didn't know
Yeah.
that you'd clubbed together to get her over there. That's really brave of her to go and do, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, she confronted him in Australia and said, I mean, he
Was
just
it?
didn't
Oh,
know what to say.
yeah. Was it the same woman, I won't mention her, that did a talk and we came to listen to her?
Um, no, I don't think so. Um,
I think there were women that had been abused through the all of that.
yeah,
They were left-wing activists, if I
yeah,
remember.
they were environmental activists.
Yeah.
Yeah, um,
Okay. And didn't some of those policemen actually have families as well? So
yep,
they cheated on their own families in the
yep.
process of.
One of them who actually fathered a child with an environmental activist, actually had a family outside of that and two other children of his own.
Hmm,
I mean, that they now claim that they don't do that anymore, but with all the evidence that's been given to the Pitchford inquiry, I have my doubts.
got to be careful.
Yeah,
But can I just ask one question? That from what you were talking about, I didn't realize, but when you were talking about Giselle, the
yeah.
lady who was,
Giselle Pellico, yeah.
yeah, and you said that the judge or the courts or whatever said that, or he only got that much of a sentence was because it was permissible if the husband gave consent for his wife. Is that
No,
just a French law or something? I mean,
no,
I
no,
don't.
no, no, no. They didn't. They did get proper. Well, it depends what you think is a proper sentence, but that was the defence that they used. The defence they used was that, although that's not a defence under French law, but that was the defence they used. Well, he told me I could do it. Um, that he'd given them permission.
Oh,
But
I see.
yeah, but that was the
Oh my
defence,
God.
and the judge did not accept the that as a defence.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway, Jack, I don't know if anyone else wants to come in and say anything or whether you want to go and wrap up your bank holiday weekend.
Yep, I'm gonna watch the second part of um, Dear England, which I watched the first part last night. If anybody has been watching it, it's about Gareth Southgate as the England manager when he became England manager. So it's a four-part series. So
All right.
that's at 9 o'clock. So I've got plenty of time. Make
Um,
myself a cup of tea. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and especially during a bank holiday. And thank you, Claire, for hosting it once again. And next week, we're going to look at, I haven't got my sheet here. Um, oh, yeah. Next week, it's race, ethnicity, racism, and migration. Okay, so I hope you can all come along again next week.